Snow hammered the steppe on 12th January, 1943, turning the outskirts of Stalingrad into a white, shifting maze where sound carried strangely across the frozen air. A faint smell of burned oil drifted from a shattered truck nearby, mixing with the metallic scent rising from the rifle in Sergeant Major Nikolai Anisimov's hands. At 52 years old, he crouched in a half-collapsed trench that groaned under the weight of ice. His back ached from nights spent on frozen boards, yet his grip remained steady, tightened by decades of service that no paperwork could erase. A dull rumble rolled out from the horizon, followed by a flicker of orange light that bounced across snowbanks like restless sparks. Machine gun bursts crackled behind a line of ruined sheds, each burst slicing through the wind with sharp, metallic snaps. Anisimov pressed his shoulder deeper into the trench wall as granules of ice trickled down his collar. The cold stung his skin like needles, but he forced himself to breathe slowly, feeling each exhale turn into a brief cloud before fading into the darkness. Shadows moved near the tree line, barely visible through the swirling snow. Enemy scouts crept forward in a low stagger, pushing through drifts with careful, deliberate steps. Their silhouettes blended into the storm until a flare arced overhead, washing the battlefield in a ghostly blue glow. The sudden brightness exposed splintered beams, twisted barbed wire, and the blood-darkened snow around a fallen sentry, whose body lay half-buried near the communication post. The flare hissed as it descended, and the eerie silence that followed felt heavier than the artillery that usually shook the ground. Anisimov listened for the familiar stomp of friendly boots, but only the wind answered, whistling through gaps in the trench like a distant warning. His battalion had been scattered during the previous night's counterattack, leaving only a thin chain of men guarding the flank. Most were young recruits who had vanished into the storm to relay messages or fetch ammunition, and none had returned. As the snow thickened, the enemy patrol entered the outer edge of the defensive line, their movements growing bolder with each meter gained. Anisimov raised his rifle, feeling the stiff leather of his gloves scrape against the wooden stock. A tremor passed through his arm, more from exhaustion than fear, yet his vision stayed sharp. He could see the glimmer of metal on a scout's belt and the slow rotation of a signal lamp held low to the ground. A gust of freezing air swept across the trench, carrying the distant rumble of engines. The sound hinted at a larger force assembling in the darkness, preparing to crush whatever remained of the battered Soviet position. Anisimov tightened his jaw as the first scout paused just 20 meters away, scanning the trench line for movement. One wrong breath could expose him. One late trigger pull could doom the entire sector. His heart thudded once, slow and heavy as he aligned his sights. The wind shifted again, clearing the snow just enough for him to see the next wave approaching behind the scouts. Reinforcements were nowhere in sight, ammunition was scarce, and the enemy was closing with the patience of hunters who believed their prey had already surrendered. Anisimov inhaled, bracing against the cold that cut through his uniform like broken glass. Then he prepared to fire, fully aware that the next few seconds would decide not only his life, but the fate of every soldier still clinging to this frozen line. The storm that smothered the trenches in January had arrived after weeks of relentless attrition. Entire Soviet battalions had been ground down by encirclement, starvation, and night assaults that left command posts buried under shattered roofing and frozen debris. Reports drifting through scattered field radios spoke of regiments reduced to a third of their original strength, and the surviving soldiers fought with hollow eyes that betrayed months without rest. Every shelter smelled of damp wool, burnt cordite, and defeat. Anisimov had been pulled back into service only because the front demanded bodies faster than headquarters could classify them. Age was supposed to keep him in the rear, yet no one in the rear existed anymore. The official line insisted that older reservists lacked the endurance for prolonged combat, but the front didn't care about theory. It swallowed everyone without distinction, and the system bent its own rules simply to keep rifles filled. The Army's manuals still dictated rigid defense grids, straight firing lines, and predictable fallback routes. These charts looked tidy on paper, yet the battlefield shredded them within minutes. German infiltration teams exploited every gap, slipping through broken fences, flooded ditches, or collapsed brick walls. They hunted trenches from the side, bypassed machine gun nests, and cut communication wires before any officer knew an attack had begun. Entire platoons disappeared in fog before sunrise reached the steppe. Younger soldiers struggled with the chaos that unfolded around them. Most had been trained on parade fields rather than battlefields and carried their rifles with tentative, uncertain hands. They flinched at every rumble, unsure whether the sound came from friendly armor or another incoming barrage. Many collapsed from frostbite before firing a single shot, their fingers turning pale and stiff beneath soaked mittens. Meanwhile, supply convoys rarely reached the forward line intact. Trucks burned on distant roads, struck by artillery that seemed to stalk them across the frozen plains. Ammunition crates arrived half-empty, and medical kits held little more than bandages, stiff with ice. Battery shortages left field phones mute, forcing runners to cross open ground under sniper fire simply to deliver a sentence of orders that often arrived too late to matter. Anisimov recognized the widening cracks long before officers admitted anything was wrong. Patrol maps became outdated within hours, and strong points marked as secure often turned into enemy outposts by nightfall. The front shifted like a wounded animal trying to stand, unable to stabilize itself after constant blows. Each collapse sent panic rippling through neighboring units that scrambled to fill holes with men who had never even seen the area they were defending. His own company, once proud and fully staffed, resembled a skeletal formation struggling to hold ground carved by months of bombardment. Faces changed daily. Voices vanished without explanation. The trenches echoed with the groans of wounded men unable to withdraw because no reserves existed to replace them. Conditions grew harsher as the cold deepened, freezing spilled blood into dark, glassy streaks along the wooden planks. By the time Anisimov reached the sector described in headquarters reports as stable, the truth stood in front of him like a bitter joke. Nothing resembled stability here. His trench lay exposed on 3 sides, overlooked by a ridge dotted with enemy firing pits. The snow beneath his boots held the tangled tracks of previous night raids that had sliced through neighboring platoons and left caches of abandoned equipment buried in drifts. The final blow came with the realization that headquarters expected the battered company to maintain the line without reinforcements for at least 10 days. That order sealed the scale of the crisis. It confirmed that the system was running out of solutions, forcing men to confront an enemy that grew stronger with every hour. In this failing structure, Anisimov stood as both a relic and a necessity, trapped in a war machine unable to adapt to its own disintegration. And the enemy, sensing weakness, pressed toward the cracks with increasing confidence, tightening the noose around a defensive line already stretched to breaking. The pattern revealed itself slowly, emerging from nights that blended into one another beneath the constant howl of winter wind. Anisimov began noticing how enemy patrols advanced along the same battered corridor between 2 ruined farmhouses. Their boots traced identical arcs through the snow, as though the terrain itself dictated their movements. Each squad shifted through the same ravine, hugging its icy walls before branching toward the trenches. The rhythm of their advance felt mechanical, almost predictable, despite the chaos surrounding every encounter. He studied their routine from the shadows, crouching behind collapsed beams or scorched piles of bricks that still smelled faintly of burned straw. The cold made his joints ache, yet the pain never dulled his concentration. Every detail etched itself into his memory: the length of pauses, the number of scouts preceding the main force, the timing of their whispered signals. These small clues formed a map invisible to commanders who viewed the battlefield only through static diagrams pinned to headquarters walls. Official doctrine demanded that soldiers remain inside fixed defensive positions. Trenches, bunkers, and designated firing slots were considered the only safe places for sustained fighting. Leaving these structures without orders risked ambush, friendly fire, or disciplinary punishment. Reports emphasized maintaining rigid lines, even as evidence proved that static positions invited disaster. Enemy squads learned their layout quickly, slipping behind them or hurling grenades into openings that never moved. Anisimov understood the flaw with growing frustration. The brigade treated defensive warfare as a puzzle already solved, even though the enemy solved it faster. A line that never shifted became a trap for the men inside it. Younger soldiers followed instructions blindly, clinging to the belief that regulations would protect them. Anisimov, hardened by decades of service, knew better. Obedience without adaptation only created dead soldiers. One night, while retrieving bodies after a failed counterattack, he crouched in the ravine the enemy used so often. The moon reflected on the ice, illuminating small pockets of untouched snow where footprints stopped abruptly. Shell fragments glimmered beneath the pale light, and the silence felt oppressive, stretching across the frozen ground like a warning. He lowered himself behind a fallen timber and realized how perfectly the spot concealed him from the farmhouse ruins. In that moment, the idea crystallized with startling clarity. A soldier positioned here could strike at the patrol from a distance so close that escape became nearly impossible. The concept defied every rule written in the manuals. It required abandoning the trench, crawling through unpredictable terrain, and firing from improvised nests with no formal protection. It meant acting alone, without permission or coordination. The risk of being discovered by friendly units or enemy reconnaissance was enormous, yet the potential advantage outweighed every danger. A single well-placed shooter could tear open the patrol's formation and halt their infiltration attempts before they reached the trenches. Fear pressed on him with unexpected force. A misjudged move would brand him insubordinate, or worse, reckless. Commanders could strip him of rank, send him to punishment battalions, or blame him for any losses incurred by leaving his assigned position. Doubt gnawed at him, whispering that an old soldier had no business challenging doctrine forged by younger, more educated officers. But the memory of fresh graves hardened his resolve. Too many recruits had fallen because they trusted blueprints instead of instincts. Too many strongpoints had collapsed under tactics that ignored the changing battlefield. Anisimov realized that inaction carried a heavier penalty than disobedience. The only question left was whether he had the strength to act despite the consequences. He returned to the trench before dawn, snow clinging to his coat and boots soaked through. The decision settled in his chest like a cold weight that refused to melt. He would test the idea at the next opportunity, regardless of what headquarters demanded. The line needed results, not paperwork, and he no longer cared who objected. The next enemy patrol would face a defender they hadn't accounted for, one who refused to fight by their expectations. The first opportunity arrived under a moon that hung low and pale above the frozen ravine. Anisimov slipped out of the trench before dusk, dragging 2 rifles and a bundle of magazines wrapped in a torn blanket to muffle the clatter. The air burned his throat with every breath, and the snow squeaked beneath his boots despite his careful steps. He moved slowly along the ravine's edge, lowering himself into the depression he had studied so many nights before. The ground felt like iron beneath his knees, the frost seeping through his trousers until his legs went numb. He brushed away a thin crust of ice from the fallen timber and positioned himself behind it. A faint smell of old blood clung to the wood, carried by gusts blowing from the ruined farmhouses. The silence pressed down like a heavy lid, broken only by the sharp crack of distant rifle fire that echoed across the steppe. Anisimov set one rifle within reach and loaded the other, his stiff gloves scraping against the cold metal. He forced his trembling hands to steady, though each movement sent a jolt of pain through his fingers. Darkness thickened as the snow clouds drifted overhead. Soon he heard the familiar crunch of boots approaching along the ravine, the rhythm unmistakable. A low whistle cut through the wind, followed by the scrape of metal against rock. Enemy scouts advanced in a tight formation, confident in the cover the ravine provided. Their outlines flickered in the shadows, moving with the precision of men who had repeated this route countless times. Anisimov tightened his grip on the stock and raised the barrel. When the lead scout passed a cluster of broken branches, he exhaled and squeezed the trigger. The first shot cracked through the cold, echoing sharply. The bullet struck the snow beside the scout, sending a burst of powder into the air. His gloves had betrayed him, too stiff for delicate aim. A curse rose in his throat, swallowed instantly by the rising panic as the patrol halted and scanned the darkness. He rolled sideways, sliding behind a mound of frozen earth. The motion scraped his coat against jagged ice, tearing the fabric but shifting him into a lower angle. Heart pounding, he raised the rifle again and fired. This time the shot struck true, dropping the scout with a thud muffled by snow. The second soldier froze, caught between fear and confusion. Anisimov fired again, the recoil jolting through his shoulder, and the patrol scattered in disarray. A flare burst overhead, flooding the ravine with a harsh blue glow. Shadows shattered into stark shapes as the light exposed every ridge and crevice. The sudden brightness stabbed at his eyes, but he dove behind the fallen timber, feeling splinters scrape his cheek as he pressed his face to the wood. Bullets sliced through the air, snapping overhead with the hiss of angry insects. Snow exploded in small bursts around him as the patrol fired blindly toward the echo of his shots. He crawled toward the second rifle, dragging himself through the frigid slush until he reached it. His coat soaked through instantly, chilling him to the spine. The flare dimmed, leaving the ravine in a smear of darkness that seemed even deeper after the blinding light. He lifted the second rifle and opened fire in short, controlled bursts, striking at shadows that darted between rocks. Each shot pushed the patrol farther back, breaking their attempt to regroup. Within minutes, the surviving scouts retreated toward the farmhouses, shouting warnings to unseen comrades. Anisimov stayed frozen in position, listening to the fading footsteps and ragged breathing in the wind. The snow absorbed the final echoes, leaving only the rustle of drifting flakes brushing against his coat. The fight ended almost as abruptly as it began, yet the impact settled on him with growing weight. His unauthorized tactic had worked, not flawlessly, not cleanly, but decisively enough to halt a patrol that had slipped through their line dozens of times before. The ravine no longer belonged to the enemy. It belonged to him now, and he knew they would return furious and prepared. The success brought no relief, only a sharpening of the stakes. He had crossed the threshold, and there was no turning back. The effects of Anisimov's ambush became visible before dawn. Enemy patrols that once prowled the ravine with practiced ease now hesitated near its edges, scanning every ridge for the unseen marksman who had shattered their confidence. The snow revealed scattered trails, showing abrupt turnarounds, as if the scouts reconsidered their approach mid-stride. Commanders in nearby trenches noticed the sudden reduction in infiltration attempts and began asking how a single sector had gone from chaotic skirmishes to eerie quiet. When Anisimov returned to his unit, frost still clinging to his coat, the younger soldiers stared at him with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Word spread quickly, rippling through dugouts and half-buried shelters like a rumor too promising to ignore. Officers summoned him for explanation, and he knelt beside a lantern to sketch crude diagrams in the dirt. He pointed out firing arcs, blind spots, and the narrow funnels that channeled enemy patrols into predictable routes. The flame flickered across the lines he carved, sharpening the urgency in his voice. The sketches defied standard doctrine, yet their results were undeniable. Junior commanders began copying the diagrams onto scraps of cardboard torn from ration boxes, distributing them among platoons that barely had ammunition to spare. The shift happened quietly at first. 2 or 3 soldiers slipped out at dusk to dig shallow pits near supply routes, testing the idea without seeking permission. Snow mounds rose overnight in patterns previously unseen, forming a scattered chain of hidden positions across the sector. Engineers joined the effort without official orders. They carved narrow foxholes with entrenching tools, widening them only enough to allow a soldier to pivot and fire. Frozen earth chipped away in brittle chunks that sparkled under lamplight, the smell of churned soil mixed with the cold scent of pine drifting from shattered timbers. Men worked quickly, driven by the knowledge that enemy patrols could appear at any moment. Supply clerks, who rarely handled anything beyond ration tins and boots, discovered newfound creativity. They misplaced boxes of rifle rounds, redirecting them to companies that needed extra magazines for forward pits. No paperwork recorded the transfers, yet no one questioned the sudden abundance of ammunition among battered units that had been scraping the bottom of their crates the previous week. Even medical stations contributed by providing spare blankets for sound-damping wraps. As the system adapted, new problems emerged with equal speed. Snowstorms buried the fresh pits each night, forcing soldiers to dig them out before the next patrol. Some officers resisted the change, insisting that deviating from the manual invited disaster and diluted the coherence of the defensive line. Their objections carried the weight of rank, yet their credibility eroded with every failed counterattack they launched according to doctrine. Men listened politely, then returned to the ravines and tree lines, where survival depended on initiative instead of instructions. Anisimov moved between these evolving positions, assessing each with the eye of a craftsman refining his work. He crawled into pits to test sightlines, corrected mounds that cast shadows too noticeable, and advised soldiers to reposition based on new tracks left by enemy scouts. Each adjustment sharpened the perimeter, turning the sector into a web of unpredictable firing points rather than a single brittle trench. Pressure mounted as enemy reconnaissance adapted. Their patrols grew more cautious, but also more numerous, probing for weaknesses in the newly altered landscape. Flares illuminated unfamiliar shapes in the snow, revealing pits where none had existed before. German officers responded with suspicion, then fury, suspecting a much larger force behind the sudden shift. Despite growing resistance from both sides of the front, the transformation took hold. What began as a single unauthorized idea spread across the company, then the regiment, carried by desperation and fueled by results. The defensive line no longer resembled the rigid grid printed in manuals. It became a living system, shaped by necessity and held together by men who refused to wait for permission to survive. And in the center of this change stood Anisimov, aware that the enemy would soon test the new positions with a force far greater than scattered patrols. The decisive assault began just before sunrise on 28th February 1943, when a dense fog rolled across the steppe and swallowed the ravines in a cold, pale shroud. The mist clung to the ground like damp wool, carrying the smell of diesel fumes drifting from engines hidden beyond the tree line. Anisimov crouched inside his forward pit, feeling frost creep through his coat as he pressed his shoulder against the frozen earth. The silence felt unnatural, stretched tight like a wire ready to snap. A distant vibration rose from the fog, faint at first, then heavier. Metal tracks grinding against ice, followed by muffled, shouted commands. The enemy had committed armored carriers for the first time in weeks. Their silhouettes appeared as dark shapes floating inside the fog, accompanied by infantry advancing in staggered lines. Snow crunched beneath dozens of boots, moving with chilling coordination. Anisimov steadied his breathing, tasting the metallic tang of adrenaline at the back of his throat. He waited until the leading soldiers entered the narrow funnel he had mapped so carefully. Their helmets glimmered through the mist, illuminated by flashes of signal lamps guiding them forward. They believed the ravine lay unguarded. The regiment's trenches had fallen eerily quiet during the night, giving the illusion of collapse. Anisimov lifted his rifle, feeling the wood tremble against his palm, and waited for the exact moment when their formation stretched into its weakest shape. The first volley erupted from his pit with a sharp, cracking echo that shattered the stillness. 3 soldiers fell instantly, their bodies plunging into the snow with soft, muffled thuds. Confusion rippled through the enemy line as they scattered toward the rocks, unsure where the shots had originated. Shouts filled the ravine, bouncing off the frozen walls in chaotic bursts. Anisimov shifted position, rolling behind a second firing point and unleashing another rapid sequence that struck soldiers attempting to regroup. Armor engines roared to life, pushing carriers forward in a grinding surge. The fog thinned for a moment, revealing steel hulls coated with frost. Machine guns stitched the ground around Anisimov's pit, spraying icy soil across his face. He ducked behind the timber, feeling hot fragments of splintered wood sting his cheek. The air thickened with the smell of burning lubricant as carriers pivoted toward his position, unaware that the pit had already been abandoned. He crawled to a third nest he had carved earlier, dragging himself through slush that soaked through his gloves. His fingers burned as cold seeped into every joint. A burst of gunfire erupted behind him, striking the pit he had vacated seconds earlier. Snow exploded upward in a violent plume, showering him with frozen shards. He wiped his eyes and fired again, targeting the infantry that had pushed too far ahead of their armor. The shots tore open their flank, forcing them to retreat toward the carriers. The enemy attempted to reorganize, but the fog hid Anisimov's movements with merciless efficiency. He shifted from nest to nest, striking from new angles every few seconds. His rifle thundered across the ravine in unpredictable rhythms, creating the illusion of multiple shooters. Panic spread through the attacking force as their formations crumbled under relentless, precise fire. Minutes stretched into something longer and heavier. The carriers hesitated, their commanders unwilling to advance blindly into a kill zone they no longer understood. Their engines rumbled without confidence, as though the machines themselves sensed the danger hidden within the mist. Infantry units shouted contradictory orders, some urging a push forward while others demanded an immediate retreat. The breakthrough attempt faltered. Then it broke entirely. When reinforcements finally reached the ridge, they found the assault stalled in a tangle of abandoned gear, scattered rifles, and bodies half buried in drifting snow. The enemy had fallen back into the fog, dragging their wounded in frantic waves, leaving the ravine strangely quiet once more. Anisimov leaned against the icy wall of his pit, chest heaving, hands trembling from cold and exhaustion. Frost clung to his mustache, and the air around him reeked of spent gunpowder. His forward line had held, not through numbers, not through orders, but through a tactic born in defiance and sharpened under fire. And deep inside the fog, the enemy now understood that the old soldier was not an obstacle. He was the barrier they could not break. The battle's echoes faded slowly, leaving behind a landscape shaped by fire and frost. Smoke clung to the air for hours, drifting in thin ribbons that carried the harsh smell of burned fuel across the ravine. When the fog finally lifted, the full extent of the destruction appeared. Shattered rifles half buried in snow, torn coats frozen stiff where they fell, and churned earth marked by frantic footsteps. The silence that settled over the sector felt unnaturally heavy, as if the ground itself had absorbed the screams and refused to release them. Reinforcements moved cautiously through the aftermath, their boots crunching over icy debris. Many stopped when they reached Anisimov's pits, staring at the narrow shelters that had become the center of a storm they barely understood. Officers took notes while medics examined the positions, trying to piece together how one man had held back an assault backed by armor. Their disbelief deepened with every step. Trails of blood, spent casings, and drag marks told a story of chaos pushed in reverse, an attack rolled back by precision instead of numbers. Anisimov stood apart from the others, leaning on the edge of his pit as exhaustion pulsed through his body. His hands trembled uncontrollably, though the cold alone couldn't explain it. The battle had drained him in ways no report would ever capture. He felt the ache in his shoulders from each recoil, the sting of frozen air inside cracked skin, and the dull throb behind his eyes from hours spent staring through drifting fog. Victory carried no triumph. It left only weight. Commanders summoned him within hours. Their tent smelled of damp wool and kerosene, lit by a lantern that flickered each time the wind pressed against the canvas. Reports lay scattered across a folding table, signed by officers who struggled to reconcile numbers that seemed impossible. In 82 days of fighting, the sergeant major had recorded 309 confirmed kills. No sniper had produced such a tally in this sector. No machine gun team had come close. Yet the man responsible stood before them with frost-burned cheeks, cracked lips, and a posture shaped more by fatigue than pride. They questioned him about distances, angles, and weather conditions, probing for exaggeration or error. Anisimov answered quietly, describing the events without embellishment. His voice carried the flat tone of a man recounting duty rather than achievement. Each statement revealed another detail of a battle fought in creeping cold and choking fog, where every shot demanded total concentration. Officers exchanged glances, realizing the line had survived because one soldier refused to collapse with the system around him. Praise followed, though it felt misplaced. Soldiers slapped his shoulder in gratitude, whispering how his actions had saved their positions, their ammunition, and their lives. Younger recruits regarded him with a mixture of awe and fear, unsure how a man twice their age had endured what they barely survived. Yet Anisimov accepted their thanks with lowered eyes, aware that each congratulation reminded him of lives taken, not lives spared. When night approached, he returned to the ravine alone. The cold deepened, turning every exhalation into a drifting cloud that shimmered under the moonlight. He knelt beside the timber that had shielded him during the attack and pressed his glove into the snow. The tranquility felt dishonest. Beneath the quiet surface lay the memory of collapsing bodies, suppressed cries, and the frantic rhythm of battle. Nothing in the stillness erased those echoes. The army would write reports. Commanders would send recommendations for medals. History would tally his accomplishments with precise numbers. But the man who fought the battle felt only the lingering weight of survival, the burden that comes when victory demands everything except celebration. When spring finally softened the edges of the frozen front, the ravine that had once echoed with rifle fire transformed into a quiet scar across the land. Meltwater trickled along its walls, carrying fragments of splintered wood and rusted shell casings toward the low marshes beyond the ridge. The air smelled of thawing soil and wet grass, a stark contrast to the bitter metallic chill that had dominated the winter battles. Soldiers passing through the area paused instinctively, sensing the weight of what had happened there even after months had passed. Military investigators arrived soon after the thaw. They spread maps across makeshift tables, walking the ground with rulers, notebooks, and cameras. Their reports traced every detail of Anisimov's improvised defense system: pit placement, firing angles, camouflage techniques, and the unpredictable spacing that confused enemy patrols. The photographs captured more than positions. They documented the ingenuity of a soldier who had refused to surrender to outdated doctrine. Analysts studied the layouts with a seriousness normally reserved for large-scale operations, realizing that a single man's adaptation had stabilized an entire sector during one of the harshest periods of the campaign. The findings moved quickly through Army channels. Training officers in rear camps began incorporating his methods into new lessons, emphasizing fluid positions and rapid relocations instead of rigid trenches. Recruits practiced firing from shallow pits, shifting locations after each volley, and using terrain irregularities as natural shields. Manuals that once praised straight lines now included sketches resembling the crude diagrams Anisimov had drawn in the dirt during the darkest days of winter. His approach spread further than he ever intended, carried by necessity and validated by results. Yet recognition meant little to him. After the front pushed westward and his regiment rotated to a quieter sector, Anisimov requested to remain with the younger soldiers who had fought beside him. They shared cramped barracks filled with the smell of damp linen and machine oil, and he spent evenings repairing rifles, adjusting worn straps, and showing recruits how to judge wind by watching grass bend along the embankments. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words carried the blunt clarity of experience earned at a price few understood. Visitors from headquarters occasionally arrived to deliver official acknowledgments. They brought polished certificates, commendations stamped with officer signatures, and letters from senior command praising his resilience. One delegation even attempted to record his testimony for archival purposes. He declined politely, insisting that the focus remain on the men who had held the line with him, not on an aging soldier who had simply done what circumstances demanded. The officers left with respectful nods, sensing that no award could capture the depth of what he had carried through that winter. As the years passed, his story shifted into something quieter, but no less powerful. Veterans who served with him retold fragments of the battles in hushed tones around barracks fires, adding their own memories to the growing legend. The younger generation heard these accounts like distant echoes, unsure whether the tales exaggerated the truth. Yet every soldier who had seen the ravine during the thaw knew the reality needed no embellishment. Museums eventually displayed a few of his recovered items: a battered rifle with a worn grip, a frost-bitten coat that still bore the faint smell of smoke, and a faded sketch showing the placement of his forward pits. Visitors studied these relics with silent respect, unaware that the man behind them had never sought an audience. His legacy lived not in speeches or monuments, but in the practices carried forward by soldiers who learned to survive by adapting rather than obeying blindly. In the end, the ravine outlived the battle. Grass covered the pits, snow filled the cracks each winter, and time softened the violence etched into the terrain. Yet beneath the earth lay the quiet imprint of a soldier who refused to disappear into the background of war. His actions shaped doctrine, saved countless lives, and left a mark deeper than any medal. And when the wind passed over the ridge, stirring the grass with gentle, uneven waves, it carried the last trace of his story, a legacy built not on glory, but on endurance, resolve, and a single unwavering decision made in the heart of winter.